We are now in the post-lunch session, and I'm going to recognize next Senator Springer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to add my voice in support of this bill, which seeks to establish a regime to promote the integrity of persons in public life and strengthen measures for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption. Mr. President, according to Transparency International, there's evidence to suggest that those in privileged positions in public life and those in power can sometimes cause irreparable damage to a country's reputation and its economy by acting against public interest. And for small countries such as ours that are already affected in so many ways, are disadvantaged in so many ways, this can have a debilitating effect on our already vulnerable economies. Now, Mr. President, despite what was said earlier by the Honourable Senator who has been seconded to the other side, the Caribbean is known as one of the most democratic spaces in the developing world. And we have been fortunate that for the most part, we respect freedoms, we hold regular, fair, and free elections, and there's peaceful transfer of power from one government administration to another. And Barbados has been a good example of such democratic practices, Mr. President. However, as we look through the region, we can see that there are countries that would have had different experiences. If we consider Guyana, that is currently in an electoral stalemate, or we look further north to Jamaica, which has had a long history or a long culture of entrenched garrison political culture within their democracy, we can see how easily democracy that we all hold so dearly, how easily and how seriously it can be undermined by acts of corruption. Now, even though these examples might seem extreme within the context of this region, we cannot look at what might be perceived as a speck in our neighbor's eyes without first focusing on our own situation here in Barbados. We must acknowledge and accept that there have been instances of corruption, perhaps under both administrations, over the years. And worse yet, this corruption has become normalized over time, where persons expect that they can pay or receive gifts in exchange for favors. What we refer in Belgian parlance as getting something for something. And though these acts may seem small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, what they really do, Mr. President, is undermine the very fabric of our democracy. Notions of fairness, undermine transparency and accountability. Such, Mr. President, is the pernicious nature of corruption. You don't notice it, but it's there. So to widen the discussion on corruption, because I don't want to look at it through a very narrow lens of just quid pro quo, as they call it. It must be noted that corruption also involves, and this is important to note, the manipulation of policies and rules of procedures by persons in decision-making roles for private gain, as well as abuse of state resources. And I want you to think about that. Those persons in decision-making roles in the public service. Who are these people? Who am I referring to? The very same persons that the Honourable Senator, the seconded one, would have us believe hands are all clean, do not get involved in any form of corruption in this country. Over the years, Mr. President, because of this corruption, a number of persons have been polarized, marginalized, disenfranchised, only because they lack the links or the connections to persons in high office. Those who make the decisions. So I'm focusing on ourselves and the state of our democracy. We must understand that such corrupt behavior threatens its integrity. It erodes public trust. It undermines the quality of public service, and it leads to what some refer to as political apathy. And we would have seen a lot of this under the previous administration. But this bill, Mr. President, this Integrity in Public Life bill that we are debating here this afternoon, seeks to take us to a higher level of democratic maturity by seeking to directly and frontally address these issues that we have seen come so rampant in our society over the years. Mr. President, another reason why I support this bill is because it represents a renewal of the social contract between government and the people of this country. After what we experienced, after what we went through under the previous administration, Mr. President, this government came to office determined to stamp out rampant acts of corruption and to enhance, in doing so, public confidence and trust in the governance of this country. In essence, what this bill also represents is a recommitment of that promise to the people. It's a translation of our intention as a government to make concrete steps, to make true the promise that we would have given of building the best Barbados together. Concrete steps in that direction of building the best Barbados together. As public representatives, Mr. President, we are entrusted with immense responsibility and power responsibility to look after the interests of the public. And integrity demands that we act in the best interests of the public. I believe it was the Prime Minister who said it last year that we do not need to be corrupt to get through. We do not need to be corrupt to get through. And it's true, we don't. But there are some among us who do not believe that. So just let me briefly touch on those persons who hold high office in the civil service. We are blessed to have a skilled and competent civil service. But we have to ensure, Mr. President, that this commitment to the culture of integrity and that it permeates through that sector as well, that space as well. This bill seeks to provide an ethical framework to put mechanisms in place to help in fostering a culture of integrity for those in public life. That's all it does. It seeks to create that framework. This bill not only condemns corruption, but it includes accountability mechanisms that underpins integrity and proposes disciplinary arrangements in the public service. And this is with the setting up of the Integrity Commission that was alluded to earlier in the debate. I think at the end of it all, Mr. President, those of us in public life always have to ask ourselves this question. In whose interests do we serve? And our answer should either affirm our position and commitment, or cause us to evaluate where we stand. Mr. President, this bill on integrity in public life is important, but we should be careful we do not turn it into a moral issue related only to those in political life. Instead, we should address also the social and cultural aspects of corruption that the Honourable Senator alluded to earlier. Particularly the level of social tolerance for corruption amongst the Barbadian public. As a mature nation, we need to ask ourselves the hard questions. To what extent have we made certain unethical practices acceptable in society? And to what extent does it undermine our social capital? To what extent? It is all well and good to have a legal framework in place, but I think that a more holistic approach is going to be necessary if we are going to thoroughly address this problem of corruption. One that goes beyond the legalistic and takes into account the strong role played by society in normalizing certain behaviors. We have to think about resetting mindsets. And this, Mr. President, I believe is going to be the most difficult, but yet most necessary part of this transformation process. Furthermore, I believe that the mechanisms put in place by this bill will not function effectively as transformative agents if there's no supportive political culture. How do we reorient the mindset of persons who have grown so accustomed to corruption that they no longer see it as wrongdoing? How do we? In fact, let me use this as an example. There was a general belief, and I think Senator Greenidge alluded to this earlier, that persons entering public life, political life, poor from the working class, should not leave public life poor. And if they were to do so, they were considered to be fools in some quarters. That was a belief in this country. I've heard it before. Now tell me, how does a politician get rich? What is the expectations of the public of politicians? Certainly can't get rich based on your salary. So how do they expect politicians to get rich? How do we reorient the minds of young persons, especially, who see vote buying, vote selling as okay? Or persons who believe it is acceptable for certain state employees to hide out in rum shops and park in cat rows and wait until 4:30 to start work so they can claim overtime. How do we reorient the minds of persons to see this type of behavior as unacceptable, as corruption? Because that is corruption too. And there are countless examples of that, Mr. President, that I wouldn't have to list, but when we think about it, we are aware of these things. People must see this as corruption. Not only politicians are corrupted, there's corruption right across the board. Different levels, entry level, middle management, and those civil servants in high office. So in as much as I support this bill, and given what I said earlier, it would be remiss of me not to mention that not all parliamentarians, not all of those persons who hold high office engage in corrupt practices. In fact, the vast majority of public officials, both elected and appointed, have given sterling and dedicated service to this country and have not engaged in any kind of corruption. And those I would want to commend. But then there are others in both the public and private sector and they want to make the point that in many cases we blame public sector workers and politicians for corruption, but it's really those in the private sector who entice them. They're the ones with the money who engage them to get involved in these corrupt acts. Because they have the money. The politician and the officer may have the influence, may have the position, but the private sector is where the money is. So those don't believe for a moment that they all play by the rules, because they don't. And that is important to note. But this bill will hold such persons, the ones in the public sector, to account. The ones in the private sector, they will be dealt with in another way. So this is why this bill is important. This bill sends a clear message to persons in public life and to citizens that there must be a level of accountability and transparency of persons within the public sector. And it's the responsibility of all involved to say something if they witness blatant acts of corruption. It's their responsibility, Mr. President. I'm going to just reach to the clause within the bill that speaks to this piece of legislation having compelled persons to speak out. Because for far too long, we've been seeing within our space, within our offices, our departments, blatant acts of corruption. And persons were turning a blind eye and deaf ear on the basis that it was not their business. But corruption is everybody's business, Mr. President. So the Act in Clause 27, I believe it is, it states that a person exercising public functions who knows or suspects that another person has been or is likely to engage in the contravention of this act shall report this knowledge or suspicion to the Commission. Even if you suspect that persons are thieving, according to the honourable member on the other side, it is your duty to report it. A person exercising public function who without reasonable excuse failed to report his knowledge or suspicion as required by subsection 1 is guilty of an offence and is liable on conviction on indictment to a fine of 5,000 or to imprisonment for 6 months or to both. And it's unfortunate that you have to come to this point. But the reality is that if you see something, say something. Because it affects you. Because that money that they are stealing, it has to come from somewhere. It's not coming out of space. People need to understand that they can no longer ignore corruption, because corruption is like a termite, and it's eating away at the very core of society. An ever-present danger that must be confronted and dealt with, even if it makes us uncomfortable, and it will make us uncomfortable. But it's something that has to be done. It's real, it's inconvenient, but it's important that we stamp it out. And these persons who engage in this rampant corruption are reined in and dealt with. So, Mr. President, in closing, I began my presentation by lauding the Caribbean as a democratic space, and by saying that Barbados is perhaps the best example of a maturing democracy. If you will permit me, I want to share at least this last caveat, and it comes in the words of Kofi Annan, who wrote that building democracy is a complex process. Elections are only a starting point. But if integrity is compromised, so is the legitimacy of democracy. I repeat that. Elections, he said, building democracy is a complex process. elections are only a starting point. But if integrity is compromised, so is the legitimacy of democracy. And with these words, I want to end by commending this integrity bill as a step in the right direction as we seek to improve and consolidate our democracy and at the same time address our shortcomings. Mr. President, I'm obliged.
I next recognize Senator Boyce.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Following on from a very inspired contribution, and it really gave me some food for thought. Sir, for my part, this legislation clearly has a laudable purpose, and today we have seen a variety of statements with regard to how wide a net it may cast. Then we have heard more recently, and I thought normally I was the one to come with the idealistic perspective, but our fellow senator just went down that path for me, and I'm very grateful. So we have those who say it's too wide, and we now hear the idealistic reasoning as its purpose to seek to rein in the concept or what may be viewed as corruption within the nation. For my part, Mr. President, I view it more as an application or legislation rooted in practicality. I wouldn't compare it to Damascus, a road to Damascus moment, Mr. President, but I was driving to the office yesterday when we had what we like to call weather. And there was a young man who was being allowed to cross the road because a vehicle had stopped. And there was a time when you crossed the road or someone allowed you to cross, you waved and you thanked the person and you went about your business. And this young man, however, Mr. President, had such a look on his face of anger or contempt or whatever it was. And I thought to myself that this is an example of who we have to reach. And that wasn't in the context of what we're discussing in terms of corruption or integrity, but it's just from a practical appreciation that if we have so many angry youth out there and we don't reach them through education or whatever social policy that's there, the practical consideration is that we then pay the price because the anger has to go somewhere. There has to be an outlet. So for me, sir, this legislation is a practical exercise in which we as a society say, this is where we are, and this is what we expect of those who, for whatever reason, find themselves with the mantle of being in public life. And it's a start, Mr. President. It's going to be inconvenient, certainly. I believe Senator Dr. Springer spoke about that. And I've had some looks from my wife in relation when I was discussing it with her in terms of what she would have to declare. And sir, it's going to also be inconvenient in terms of the compliance procedure, the steps to file, the ensuring that you do it in time, and then of course the fact that it's not exactly clear what aspect of the register is open to public scrutiny. Of course, if you don't do it, then there's a $50,000 fine, $50,000, and or risk of imprisonment for 1 year. And when you contrast the $50,000 to what is gained, it may seem as though it's an uneven an uneven burden. However, I believe, sir, that if we reframe it as part of our contribution, that we add it to our obligations as citizens, Mr. President. And it's an obligation that we bear, recognizing that while we see those who are disadvantaged and we have to do our part, this will then become part and parcel of doing our part, Mr. President. And maybe it's a comparatively light burden compared to what others have to carry in their service to the nation. And maybe when we look at it from that perspective, we might find ourselves a bit more willing to engage in the obligations if the $50,000 fine doesn't spur you. One of the best quotes I heard in relation to this issue, though, Mr. President, was when we were at the historic Parliament building, and Senator Rogers, before he was doctor, sir, said a line that stuck with me. And he said, "You cannot legislate morality." I believe it was Senator Rogers. And I thought that was a fantastic quote, Mr. President. We are not seeking here today to say we wish to be moral police of persons who conduct themselves in public life. I believe what we are saying here today is that those of us who find ourselves in this position recognize that there are certain obligations which come with it. And maybe, and just maybe, we start today to make it a more commonplace concept. There was a time, Mr. President, that I understand these devices were frowned upon within the chamber, sir. There was a time, Mr. President, we had to find ourselves in a physical space to conduct business, to conduct even pleasure. Now the world is changing and we find ourselves utilizing the technology with regard to those aims. So maybe what we do here today starts us on the road by which we start to give more consideration to how those in public life find themselves, maybe for the better, maybe for worse, subject to more scrutiny. The 1929 Corruption Act, Prevention of Corruption Act, can't do its job. But like with anything else, we adjust with the times. But it's not just enough to pass the legislation, because it has been seen very often, I wouldn't say in this jurisdiction, sir, but I'm sure that any basic Google search would reveal that there are many commissions relating to integrity that have become toothless tigers. Now, some will say a toothless tiger still has claws. But if you have a commission which is not given the resources by which to do its job, then you have a commission in name alone. If you have a commission which doesn't have the independence by ensuring that its finances are not subject to the whims of government, then you just have a commission in name alone. If you have a commission which is burdened and unable to get to the variety of issues that it has to engage in, you just have a commission in name. So hopefully the powers that be will ensure that the commission is given the tools to conduct its affairs. Another aspect that would be required, Mr. President, is the education. And not just education in terms of the optics and education in terms of the buy-in, but education in terms of, one, stakeholders being aware as to what the obligations now are, and perhaps being given a period to get their affairs in order, Mr. President, the penalty being what it is. But also education for the public in the form, because there has been extensive dialogue, but education to the public in the form as to what the Commission will be doing. And the Commission's resources would therefore become relevant in that aspect. For example, Mr. President, the legislation currently requires that the Commission has to make a report to the DPP for action to be taken. I think everyone here is aware that the DPP's office is working extremely hard and is working on clearing the backlog. Where are the resources going to be to allow the DPP to take on the extra burden that's going to come with the Commission's requests? So these are the type of questions that I would hope would be addressed, and I hope that the financing will be there and the resources provided to allow the Commission to go about its affairs. In some jurisdictions, some have even suggested that the Commission has an independent authority with which to prosecute matters, but if it's one thing I've learned is that while we do things in this country, we do them properly and we take our time, not necessarily being lazy, Mr. President. So I can say that this bill has my support. I can say that it is a first step. I would also say, though, that I hope the resources are given to allow the Commission to do its job, but that we also ensure that the education is provided as to what will be done, timelines given for persons to get their affairs in order, Mr. President. And of course, you would know the Latin, sir, who watches the guards? So the Commission and the commissioners and the members of the Commission are required to file certain documents with Her Excellency. But who is then responsible, and where are the resources provided for ensuring that that task is done and ensuring that the Commission exercises its function in the manner that it should? But these questions all flow, and these questions hopefully will be resolved. We move forward, Mr. President, and this legislation has my support. Thank you, sir.
Senator Adams? Your turn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't usually get to speak after Senator Boyce. I don't know if I've ever told him this story, but I actually took a flight with his father once, just as I was appointed to the Senate. And he said, "Oh, Kevin, we'll be in there with you." He's very independent. And I think that contribution that you just made underlined the faith your father had in you. Mr. President, I think the very first thing I want to say is congratulations to the government, to the Attorney General, to everybody who took part in the Joint Select Committee process. I think this Integrity in Public Life Bill is monumental in more than one regard. But I'll start with the historical context that makes it monumental. Mr. President, I think politicians in this country, no one would disagree, are not generally held in high esteem by the public, at least generally not in their own lifetimes. This is nothing new. There are exceptions. But it's captured in a quote I found in Hansard when I was preparing for this debate. And the quote runs like this: "This idea of corruption has now become a way of life, and no matter what any particular individual may say, it is the attitude of the people of this country that politicians today in Barbados are corrupt, and that they are only in Barbados for what they can get out of it." Now that was said on the 16th of October, 1973. And it was said by the current Prime Minister's grandfather. on a day that the then DLP government was faced with a no-confidence motion and a resolution to modernize the very act that we've heard referenced today, the 1929 Prevention of Corruption Act. Neither of those resolutions passed, but I refer to that quote, sir, because it's symbolic, I think, of the way our approach to anti-corruption and integrity has been treated in this country. By resistance or inertia, that 1929 Act has sat on the books and, in an ironic twist, has reinforced this very judgment of politicians in our country. Now, we're at the point, and Senator Franklin touched on this, but I'm going to interpret it slightly differently. We're at the point where it is other countries who are now prosecuting our politicians for corruption. And Senator Franklin, he said all we've got to do is enforce that 1929 Act. Why are we doing all of this? And I'd say the real question there is, why are we not using that Act? And I think the answer is that there are structural obstacles to us using that Act. Senator Boyce just talked about resources. I think that is one of the problems with trying to enforce an Act that's 91 years old. But it's not the only one. We simply don't have the legislative structures that make that Act effective. So, for example, if you had been listening to the debate in the other place, this is one part of a suite of legislation that is coming. And I expect we may hear some objections to the splitting of these acts. But this is integrity, anti-corruption will come, and there's whistleblower protection. Now, I think in a small country like ours, that whistleblower protection is particularly important. And it's one of the reasons it's so difficult to use an act, 91 years old, that is only 5 substantive pages long, has no particular resources allocated to it. Not much more complicated than that. Now, when I prepared my notes, of course, I know we have to be mindful of what other senators say, and I wasn't going to touch on this, but it's striking to me that one of the objections we've heard so far is that the tone for integrity has to be set from the top, and we can't expect everything that's below that to follow the canons of probity, as it were, if we're not doing the right job at the top. If only the top were doing what it's supposed to do, then everything would trickle down. I believe that was the expression Senator Drake's used. I find it very hard to put a lot of faith in the argument that says we don't need to include everybody in this kind of legislation. We only need to deal with those at the top. I'm not even sure what further arguments I can muster against that. It makes little sense to me. This is a societal problem. We've heard it in several places. We cannot seriously be saying that focusing a piece of legislation on 30 people, and I exclude the 21 for the moment because we've also heard arguments that presume the 21 in here because they only receive, I'm glad you get 1,400, I think I get 1,387 a month. You know, how can we say that because of that, these people must be excluded from, should be excluded from coverage? It doesn't make sense. I mean, I could advance an argument. You know what, I will, and I don't say this to be unkind, but if we're going to say that, as Senator Franklin you did, that you know many of the civil servants who are now being captured by this, they are clients of yours. And then in the next breath, we're going to say, I'm not going to vote for this legislation unless that subset, who happen to be my clients, are removed from it. An argument could be made, I'm not making it, I'm just saying it's possible, that is ethically questionable, that your vote could be used to protect the very people who actually pay your wages. And this is just a small example. This is a societal problem. It doesn't focus on merely 30 people or another 21 people, and we're all caught by it. Now, there was another aspect, and I'm sort of used, I think we all are used to hearing stock arguments brought up by opposition senators, and one of them is rush jobs. So it's a shock to me to hear that a piece of legislation started 2 years ago that incorporates a further 9 months of consultative process and training to get everything in place is being described or characterized as something that hasn't had enough time spent on it. I think that's a little unusual. I'm going to borrow a quote here. Last time out, I'm inspired a little bit here by Senator Dr. Rogers. Last time out, he treated us to something from Voltaire. It was highly defamatory to doctors, not doctors of theology, but doctors of medicine. I thought he was brave to say it, given that Senator, Doctor of Medicine, Chris Maynard, sits within scalpel distance of him. But he did say it, and I thought it was effective. But I believe I can offer a quote here that no one will take exception to. A little older than Voltaire. It comes from Pericles. It's one I've used before. I like it. It runs like this: rather than seeing discussion as an obstacle to action, we think it an indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all. Are we seriously saying that not enough consultation has occurred on this bill? That's not an argument, I think, that bears a great deal of scrutiny. And it's something, indeed, that the Prime Minister time and time again has said consultation is critical to the way she intends to approach administration in this country. And I think it's been carried out to the full in this example, and it's shown its value. A monumental piece of legislation sits right in front of us. 91 years have gone by since that 1929 piece of legislation. And what seemed impossible to many, including the very cynical, now seems to be something just within reach. We're almost on the cusp of what I would describe as something inevitable, almost. Now, Senator Springer said a few things that I feel like he maybe peeked at my notes beforehand, but he talked about corruption, and really what he was saying is, why is this important? You know, corruption does several things. And I think top of his list was it undermines our system of justice. And he also spoke about the misallocation of resources that it can involve, especially for projects that perhaps have only seen the light of day because someone paid the right bribe, and they end up costing the public treasury too much money and not delivering what they said they would deliver. But further than that, and he talked about this, and I'm going to back it up, it encourages bad actors. It propagates bad behavior when it goes unpunished. And worst of all, and I can't remember who said it, but it was said in here, worst of all, it is not only corruption, it is the perception of corruption. And it does something very insidious. It robs the government, everybody who works in the public service, and indeed wider society, of trust in themselves and amongst themselves. And this is a slippery slope, I think, to my mind, of sliding downwards towards a disintegration of the social partnership. Trust is key, and corruption really speaks to that to a great degree. So all of that is the reason I consider this a monumental piece of legislation. That's the historical context. But there's another part here that I don't think anyone has really touched on, and it's important to me, and I don't think it's tangential. I think it's quite central. And we haven't spoken about the coherence of this legislation and its place in the government's program, a program that was announced in the manifesto in 2018. And when the government knew the election was coming, before that, the publication of this manifesto, it put down in black and white what it proposed to do. And it said to the electorate, you know, if you give us the votes, if we take the reins of government, here's the program, here's what we're going to do. We won the reins of government, and since then, Prime Minister and her ministers have systematically been doing what they said they were going to do in that document. There is no randomness to this legislation. Not only is it monumental historically, but it's doing something quite core to the government's program. And the government has managed to stick to that program despite some of the tremendous challenges that have been thrown at it. I'm thinking of things like dealing with the international creditors that the previous administration so rashly invited into our living room. It's taken a little while to get them evicted, but they are gone on our terms. I'm thinking of the hand grenades that the European Union tosses at us from time to time and attacks our international business sector in the most hypocritical and venal, I think, manner that merely hides the problems they have with their own domestic policy. But most of all, I'm thinking of the global pandemic, COVID. Now, it's easy to forget with all these headlines and panic and scrambling to cope that what the government is doing is not straying from what it said it would do. It started out in that manifesto talking about mission-critical objectives. And these were things that were really designed to extinguish some of the fires that we found burning in our country. And then it moved on to talking about those parts of the program it would deliver in order to set in place a foundation for lasting prosperity. It's not an interpretation, Mr. President. This is actually written down, as I say, and it should be repeated. Doing those mission-critical tasks and setting the foundation for lasting prosperity, well, these are things that, in the words of the former Prime Minister, Owen Arthur, allow us to go for gold. Now, I'm going to say just a few words about the program so far before placing the integrity in public life legislation within that. The Prime Minister came to office and she said she was going to deal with the mountain of debt that we found ourselves laboring under, that she was going to boost the foreign exchange reserves, she was going to give the central bank greater independence, she was going to stimulate investor confidence, put us back on our feet. All those things were done. It was described as job one. The Barbados dollar was saved from devaluation and the economy was stabilized. This allowed us to do, I can describe those as mission critical. This allowed us to do things that started to steady the ship. Who has forgotten what the South Coast Road used to look like when it was spewing raw sewage? You know, we still have water woes, but we said we would fix the problem, we fixed it, and we will fix the others as well. Who has forgotten that tertiary education, the financing for that now, has been removed, and it's easier for our young people to get the education they deserve, to get a leg up, to move ahead. Things like electric buses have been delivered, garbage trucks, so on. All these things have been done, and I'm not suggesting we should be happy that there's room for complacency. There is not. But once those things are out of the way, there are other tasks that set the course, set the foundation for lasting prosperity. The integrity legislation certainly is one of that. Like Senator Springer, I just described how corrosive, how insidious it can be if you have corruption prevailing in your country. We can believe it starts with 30 people, maybe extends to some of the 21 in here, if you believe what you've heard today. I'd suggest that's a fairy tale. This is a societal problem. It has to be dealt that way. Senator Boyce raised some very, very pertinent points on resources and independence. I thought that the bill does deal with these, some of them in a bit of a cursory manner, but I would point out on the resources front that the bill provides for these to be voted by Parliament. No system is perfect, but I think that is important. And when you talk about independence, if you look at the process by which the commissioners are appointed, first of all, we know already from the introduction by the Leader of Government Business that these come from the ranks of judges, they come from experienced attorneys, they come from experienced accountants. In both those two latter cases, who is the person who's consulted? It's the professional bodies to which they belong. So at each step, there are measures put in place to guarantee the independence. There's a space for members of the clergy. Dr. Rogers will be happy, but however, if you're a member of the Senate, you're precluded, but you know, the clergy is present. There is room for a person nominated by the Leader of Opposition and also the Prime Minister. So I think some of these questions speak to, again, the monumental work that's been done by the Joint Select Committee and the drafters. They have thought of these things. We have to, I like that phrase, who watches the guards? You know, we have to be mindful that any system, any structure needs to be monitored to ensure that it's performing as we want it to perform. I thought when I read through the legislation, I thought of Senator Franklin, I won't lie. I thought under Part 6, there is ample scope for making complaints. for those who frequently hurl allegations into, before now, a void. Now there's a chance to put those directly to a structure where they can be examined. I think the initial procedure is it will go to the complaints panel. The complaints panel will look at it, and then it will forward it on to this independent commission that I described a moment ago. However, I would say, and I like this part of the bill very much, I would say that it's not just a free-for-all for shouting what you think is wrong and making complaints. If you go and you make a complaint and it starts with the words that, well, I feel that so-and-so has done this, or my friend told me that, or one that I've heard in here, it smells like corruption. Without evidence, these things may not go too far. And indeed, under Section 29A, they can be dismissed as frivolous complaints. And further, under Section 30, if someone has made a malicious complaint, something that is judged irresponsible, they can be subject to a prison term and indeed a fine of $100,000. Now, I mention these things because I feel this bill represents a balance. We know, as Senator Boyce said, that it imposes a new burden on those that it captures. And I can understand why people are sensitive to it. And I liked, I'm going to paraphrase now, but I liked the way he described this, and I'm going to call it the price of democracy. But I think we're on the same page. If you want to make some inroads into what everyone perceives to be a problem, and indeed the U.S. justice system has shown us is a problem, you do have to pay a price. It doesn't just happen by itself. And I like this check on frivolous complaints because I feel that it will stop compulsive sensationalists just speaking and speaking and speaking. They'll be now in a position where they have to put their money where their mouths are. And I like that very much. Now, in closing, Mr. President, I want to touch on something that it does touch also on the quote that Senator Boyce referred to, made by Senator Dr. Rogers, that you can't legislate morality. This bill, I don't think, seeks to do that. I think it seeks to do something, let me put that another way. It's a reminder in many ways to me of the values that many of us, if not most of us, were taught by our parents and our schools and indeed the society, the small part of that society that we grew in as boys and girls. If we are saying that, and I've heard this argument, it's a variant of you can't legislate morality, but if we are saying that you cannot teach integrity, to my mind that means that you are saying several generations of parental effort to raise their children to know the difference between right and wrong, to know when to admit responsibility for something, to know how to say sorry, the value of keeping your word, even when it's a very uncomfortable place to be. If we're saying that we cannot reinforce those teachings, well, I reject that. In this very chamber, we have a code that is there to stop us being unparliamentary. All it's doing is reminding us of what we were taught as young people, I think. But it serves a purpose, and this is a parallel to that. We know what is right, but for different reasons, sometimes we're unable to do it. Now, we have a bill before us that's really seeking to reinforce farm erosion, these very values that we were all taught, that we're mindful of, and that we always expect to see in others, if not always ourselves. And again, this takes me back to why it's a societal problem. The challenge here is to reinforce and promote a culture of integrity, not just in 30 people, not just in 51 people, but in the entire nation, and doing that in a balanced way, which means sanctioning breaches, but it also means reinforcing when we recognize someone does represent the values of integrity. This shouldn't just be about sanction, it should also be about promotion. I think this bill goes a great distance in doing that. I tie it back with my final few moments here to the manifesto. You cannot put in place a lasting prosperity if you allow corruption and a lack of integrity, a lack of protection for whistleblowers to blossom. We have to have that in order to move forward in a new way, in a way that expands our capacity beyond what we've known until this moment. I thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Moore, it is now your turn.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me say that I was a bit constrained whether or not I would speak on this. And the reason for that is that I support the principle only of what the bill is seeking to achieve. But there are some aspects of the bill before us that make it difficult for me to offer full support to the bill. And why constrained? Because I would not wish in any way, because of the sensitive subject that we are discussing, I would not wish in any way for this honorable chamber and the public at large that will be following this debate to misconstrue my reservation for anything more than what it is, the discomfort that certain aspects of what we are trying to do brings. First thing that I would like to observe, Mr. President, is that this Integrity and Public Life Bill offers a commission very broad powers, which is a good thing. And I say that it's a good thing, but just like colleague Senator Greenidge, when he spoke, I recognize that because the commission has such broad powers, that if officers are not selected very carefully, then what is intended by the bill and the value that can obtain can be significantly compromised. I think about the investigative officers, for instance, who have the powers of arrest and so on. If you're not careful choosing the right people for these positions to avoid abuse of power, that will be one concern. Or on the flip side of that, not abuse of power, but individuals who may be easily persuaded to do something or not to do something that they are supposed to do. So it would have been a lot more comfortable if we had outlined the criteria that may be used in selecting such people. The second observation that I have to make, and we've had some months to review this bill and to compare it with other pieces of legislation across the world and across the region. And it is noted by me, Mr. President, that this particular piece of legislation offers no protection for a whistleblower. In Jamaica, for instance, the Integrity Commission Act 2017 provides that any information or document disclosed by a person or body shall not be used in any criminal proceedings against such person or body, save and except in criminal proceedings for an offense relating to the provision of false or misleading information. A bill such as this one that is so deliberate, so intent to address a particular concern, and I hasten to add, so intrusive as well, should offer some measure of protection to the people that will be involved in bringing information that may be useful to ensuring that integrity is maintained. Our bill, this piece of legislation, at least not as far as I've read, it doesn't offer such protection. The third observation that I wish to make, Mr. President, is that under this piece of legislation, where where, I'm looking for this section, I think it is section 37, where you talk about a person being exonerated following an inquiry of some alleged contravention. If a person is exonerated, this information is not naturally gazetted. What will happen if a person is exonerated? The registrar, the commission shall, in writing, inform the person who made the complaint and the person alleged to have contravened the act of the finding, and at the request of the person whose conduct was the subject of the complaint, publish the finding. That's if the person is exonerated. This is my problem when I was reading it, and maybe it doesn't seem such a major issue, but exoneration is not automatic. But if I was charged, that will be gazetted. So if there was a complaint alleged, that will be out there for everybody to see. But if I was exonerated, the commission comes to me and requests my permission, then I have my permission to put my charge out there. But that is another observation that I find a little one-sided or obzucky in the legislation. A fourth observation relates to the filing of registrable interests. Section 18. Section 18 outlines a number of interests that must be filed, particulars of directorships held in any company or body corporate, particulars of any contract made with the government or a state-owned enterprise. It goes down, beneficial interests held in land, particulars of any sources of income, etc. And Mr. President, I recognize that as being very important, as previous senators have noted, to get into the heart of the matter in the way that the bill seeks to make sure that a person who starts off with $5 when they entered public office, though end up with $5 million. That was right, $5 and $5 million? Something along that line. But Mr. President, the problem that I see is not in section 18, but the contradiction that I see in the bill before us comes at section 19. Because you have all of that with a register of, you're registering your interests, all of that is before a commission that is supposed to be sworn to secrecy and whatever else, and we have all the forms attached and the swearing in that will be done and so on. But at 19.3, the commission shall make the register of interest available for public inspection. Why do they need to be confidential if John Public can go and access the register of interest? And then when the information comes out on TikTok or wherever it may come out, Mr. President, I'm sorry, I don't have the time to explain to you what TikTok is. But when it comes out on Twitter and other social media sources and so on, no one can say that any members of the commission have breached confidence, the confidentiality, because members of the public can go, any member of the public, Mr. President, I've grown up I've been raised to understand the value of privacy. I also understand exactly what the legislation is about. But I've been raised in a household, perhaps like many other Barbadians, where you don't know how much people does make. There's some husbands and wives that don't know what the other spouse makes. In my own experience, I remember when I was a teacher at law school. Yeah, I had to go and try to impart something there. When I was a teacher I couldn't resist it. When I was a teacher at the law school, I remember my dad coming to me probably around the time of my second paycheck. And I saw for the first time what he was making, because he was a teacher himself in a primary school. And he came with a slip and put it on the dining room table, and he said, "Look at that. Go and bring yours." Put it there. Look at that and look at that. Earnestone trained teacher coming through the ranks, me coming out of university, a graduate teacher, and my salary being compared to his. And his simple advice to me was, if you're not into it for the love of it, if it doesn't bring you intrinsic satisfaction to teach and to help and to nurture others in this way, then perhaps this might not be the profession for you. Because where you are at the start of what could be a career, and where I am over 30 years into my career as a teacher, it's about $200 different. I'm just saying that because in households, people don't necessarily know everything that goes on a pay slip of the people closest to them. And I don't think you can have a relationship with a parent to child closer. Had to be careful of that because my husband might be listening. Parent to child closer than mine with my father. And I didn't know. So I'm just saying that when you have those documents there for public inspection, and you can possibly have a staff member go in and seeing, unless I misread something, let me see where GS got your mortgage, boy, and how much she still owe. I think that it borders on an invasion of privacy that can be intrusive. Not that person has anything that they want to hide, any dirt, but the pride and confidence that comes with knowing that you can keep some things private will be stripped away, and it may actually deter some people who have a useful contribution to public life from entering public life. I was not raised by a grandmother. She died when I was 7 years old. But I think that a lot of her teachings have been handed down to me through my own mother. One of those is, you don't have to wear what you are on your sleeve. You understand? A certain pride with coming from humble beginnings and remaining in humble beginnings, and you don't believe that the other 299,000 people in the population has to know. So that is one of the other observations I have. And then at the second schedule is where there's some need for clarity, at least on my part. I may have missed it in the report, and I certainly am not any clearer when I look at the schedule, second schedule, point 4, which speaks of heads of departments within public service and holders of public office in the same grade as that of such heads of department being subject to the same kind of integrity tests as others. Now, in the public service, Mr. President, you may find that a director, a head of department in one department is compensated at a different level to a head of department or a director in another department. You may find in the hospital or so that might be an S1 level, And coming down to certain departments in youth and so on, it may be an S6 level or S5 level and so on. So when this says heads of departments within the public service and holders of public office in the same grade, and you have heads of department coming in a range, does that mean, like, suppose the range is S2, S1 to S6, does that mean that anybody that falls between S1 and S6 will then have to be subject to satisfying the requirements of this legislation? And when we come down to bullet 6 in that schedule, CEOs, general managers, and other executive. Who are other executive? Because in one department, it might be apparent who the executive structure, what the executive structure is. But in some departments, and we well know that, it is not very clear what the executive structure is. So in my view, this would have needed some clarification, and that clarification perhaps can come with some expansion. So those will be my 5 points concerning this legislation. I believe that we need integrity in public life. I understand that integrity is one of those concepts that is sometimes hard to define in legislation. So I understand the tendency to want to align it to certain rigors and certain tests, like to verify. And our experience, including our recent experience, has done a lot of this to us. And I know that the government would have campaigned along the lines of bringing integrity back and respectability back to public life and so on. But I think that what, in setting about what we have defined as an objective, that we may have gone a little bit too far. And I'm wondering, especially when I make the point about filing of registrable interests and that being available to the public, how does it square with the data protection legislation that we passed previously and so on? So, Mr. President, integrity, I believe, is a must. I believe that there are many aspects of the bill. The majority of it can be supported. But for my one part, if the ambiguity and the lack of clarity around the issues that I raise when it comes time for voting are still there, I will not be in a position to give it my support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds rude.
Senator Grant?
Sounds.
Yes, very well. Proceed, Senator Sands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to lend my voice in support of this bill. Now, I'm like I said, I'm a young man for the most part. I would take guidance. They said I am a young person. And based on my day-to-day interactions and conversations with young people my age group, my peers, I tend to notice a level of cynicism emanating from young people whenever we have discussions about politicians and people that we consider to be persons in public life. Now, there's a large percentage of young people in this country, I believe so, that have general concerns about the governance of persons within public life. There's a personal belief that people in public life are corrupt. To put it frank, if you speak to young people will say to you they believe that people who exercise public functions are corrupt. But if you go further into the conversation with them and delve into the meat of the matter, 9 times out of 10 you will notice that they are unable to give you specific information or evidence to support their inner belief about aspects of corruption. They would be unable to say to you definitively which politician is corrupt or which public official is corrupt, but the feeling remains. What they will definitely say to you is that based on their observation of people in public life, people exercising public functions, they believe they operate as though they are a law unto themselves. That the persons in these 2 particular groups would enter positions and overnight become rich persons. I heard one of the Honourable Senator suggest they come in as paupers and leave probably on Forbes' list. That is a concern for a lot of young people in this country. They believe that people in public life, persons exercising public functions, abuse their power for their sole benefit. These are concerns that they have. And as I said, this viewpoint is not necessarily grounded in specific facts, but it remains a perception that they have. And with the recent development of a former minister from the previous administration being found guilty for offenses relating to corruption, or offenses related to money laundering, which quote-unquote might extend into corruption, one can only reasonably assume that this particular instance would have a detrimental impact on the way that young people would have in terms of their perception of people in public life. They have a smoking gun now. So before I might be able to say to them, well, you're unable to provide evidence to support your contention, so maybe you should refrain from saying that. Before I would be able to highlight them, just if they do a quick Google search, they can check the Corruption Perception Index and research the Transparency International, where they have Barbados ranked at 30 out of 180 countries. And the only Caribbean country within this region that is ahead of Barbados is Bahamas. That speaks volume for this country as a whole. This speaks volume to this country as a whole as it relates to the issue of corruption. But having said that, even if on that index we are not rated low as it relates to corruption, I can tell them anything. It will not change their perception. And sometimes perception is all you need. Perception is everything. Young people don't want to hear empty promises. Young people don't want to hear a lot of fancy wordplay. I'm speaking because I'm a young person. We're not interested in a lot of rhetoric. What young people want is for their issues and concerns to be addressed in a tangible way. They want to see something. They want actions to be done. They want to hear less talking. Now, in 2016, when this administration was in the opposition, the Barbados Labour Party would have launched our Covenant of Hope, which outlined who we are, what we stand for, and what we will fight for as a political party on behalf of the people of Barbados. This same Covenant of Hope outlined 10 core principles. And one of those principles, which is applicable today, is where this Barbados Labour Party indicated that it would stand for good and transparent governance. This declaration was further reflected in the Barbados Labour Party manifesto when it came up to election time. We campaigned on it, we harped on it, we said we believed in it. We indicated to the people of Barbados in clear and unambiguous terms that once we had become the government of the day, we would introduce systems, we would introduce measures that would address the issues as it relates to corruption. This party made a promise to young people. This party made a promise to the people of Barbados. And this government is not a government that makes empty promises. This government is fully aware that anybody can talk the talk, but only this government is prepared to walk the walk. This government today has honored its promise, its social contract to the people of Barbados. And most importantly, this government addresses the concerns of young people in respect of their perception of corruption as it relates to people in public life and persons exercising public functions. This bill is indeed a monumental bill. It is monumental because this bill simply does not allow the status quo to remain. We have grown accustomed to the implication that persons in public life should operate with integrity. But there was never no real parameters put in place. You can't really legislate honesty. You can't legislate persons to be you can't legislate honesty, you can't legislate persons to act in good faith. You might not be able to do those things, but what you can do is put regulations and parameters in place that if any of those type of persons slip through the cracks, systems are in place to deal with them. They will not be able to come into the circle and erode the existing structure. By their very nature, they will slowly be booted out of the system. Now, as I indicated to you, the status quo, currently as it is, technically speaking, any person in public life does not necessarily have to abide by any form of regulation as it relates to the code of ethics, to what is moral. But it is always understood that that is what is expected of them. We always expect that they will do what is morally right, what is ethical. And as I said to you before, based on the recent events, specifically with the previous minister from the previous administration, instances like that have detrimental impacts on how a society feels about the people at the quote-unquote top of the food chain. The persons who make laws, the persons who regulate laws, the persons who exercise public functions. So what this party has sought to do is directly address the issue of integrity. This particular bill today seeks to strengthen the measures for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption and ancillary matters. So once this bill is passed, I would have heard many of the other senators went through the bill clause by clause, specifically highlighting certain areas within the bill. So what I endeavor to do now is highlight specific clauses in the bill that I myself particularly like and will have great impact on our overall business going forward once this bill is passed. Now, this bill in the schedule indicated that there would be a list of specified persons, and it gave an exhaustive list of who those persons are. But these specific persons will now have to file declarations of their financial affairs with the Commission, the Integrity Commission, every 2 years, which would outline their income, their assets, their liabilities, their investments, anything of that nature. They have to file for themselves, they have to file for their children, dependent children, and they also have to file for their spouses. And I heard one of the honorable senators in here today give a reason as to why that is important. Because apparently in the past, persons would usually put assets in the friend name, the spouse name, the children name, anybody who's willing to put the name on the line to take things. That's how some persons operated in the past. So while this particular bill might not want to be as far-reaching as that, what it seeks to do is touch those persons closest to you, those persons that you most trust, those persons that you're more likely, if you are practicing corrupt actions, to involve them in your practices. And the beauty about this bill is that if you, for whatever reason, be cavalier and decide that you are not filing the declaration, nobody can ask you how much you made or what you're worth. That's fine. That's your prerogative. However, the bill grants the commission the power to name and shame you. You don't want to declare your wealth, your worth? That's fine. They have the right now to put it in the Gazette, publish it in the Gazette, as well as the newspaper, indicating your unwillingness to comply with any order as it relates to filing your declarations. I think that is a significant step for this integrity legislation. One thing Bajans don't like is to get shamed. Now, another aspect of this bill that I particularly like relates to the fines and the penalties. There's a range of fines and penalties that have been outlined in this bill, ranging from $5,000 to $50,000. Now, depending on the level of corruption and the benefit that was gained from the corruption, the fine may not necessarily be that much of a penalty, so to speak, to the individual. So take it into practical terms. Let's say that I, for instance, engaged in corruption and I benefited $5 million. The penalty may be $50,000. That is not significant. That's not significant disadvantage to me. However, the Integrity Commission has the power to pursue those persons and make a report to the DPP or the Commissioner of Police and have those persons prosecuted. That's something that was not done in the past, but now this particular bill provides the framework for them to do so. And for those who they don't pursue, it would act as a deterrent for them to even consider such an action. So it still has its place within this bill, and that is why it is also something that's significant. Another aspect of this bill relates to the fact that the Commission has the power to disqualify a member of the House of Assembly or a member of the Senate if he is convicted of an offense in this bill. If he fails to declare if he fails to file a declaration or a statement of registrable interest, the Commission can disqualify you. You can literally be put out of the House of Assembly for at least for a period of 5 years. You can be put out of Senate for a period of 5 years. That is teeth. That is real power. That is real power. That is something that the Commission can do to any person who thinks that they can flaunt this bill once it is passed. It also touches on the area of gifts. I heard one of the Honourable Senators mention it as well. The bill indicates that if you receive a gift of $2,500 value or more, you have a duty to report it to the Commission. Now, what that means is, gone are the days when you might categorize it as you just doing a good job. You're just doing a good deed. You're just doing my job, sir. Oh, thanks for doing your job. Here's a Rolex. $20,000 in value. Here's a vehicle, X5. Go and drive that boat. Gone are those days. Any form of gift you get, if it is of a value greater than $2,500, you have to report it. No ifs, no buts. Especially if it was given in official capacity. And even if it's personal, you still would have to indicate to them and let the Commission determine whether or not they deem it to be within what they consider to be a personal gift. That is something that is also significant. So no more plane tickets and lavish hotel packages and those types of things that people get in the name of doing a good job. You have some people in this country that just do a good job, and that is all that is required. A congratulations, a good commendation. That is also true. That is also true. But one of the things that I wanted to mention as well, and I wanted to read the specific sections in the bill relates to the code of conduct. The bill establishes a code of conduct for persons exercising public functions. And they thought that this was something that needed to be harped on. No, for the first time in this bill, once passed, this bill will set parameters on how people in public life should use their position. The bill states that under the heading of conduct, code of conduct for persons in public life, under the subheading use of office, a person exercising public functions shall ensure that he performs his functions and administers the public resources for which he is responsible in an effective and efficient manner, be fair and impartial in exercising his public functions, and afford no undue preferential treatment to any person. That is significant. Because on simple experiences, that has not always been the case in Barbados. You might be fair and impartial to a certain extent. He might perform his functions and administer the public resources in a responsible and efficient manner. But he might not always execute undue preferential treatment to people. Quote unquote, doing favors for your friends, helping out your friends. Simple things. Corruption is high and corruption is low. So because you don't necessarily benefit $5 million but gain $150, you're no different. Corruption is corruption. And I just want to be clear, corruption does not only relate to receiving money. Back in the day, I heard people say, sometimes people in public life don't need money because things just come free. So why do we need to be corrupt? Quote unquote. I don't need to get money to build a house when I might have access to bricks. I don't need access to buy mold when I have access to mold. All of that under this legislation is frowned upon. If it belongs to the public, it is the public's resources. It is nobody else's. And under this specific legislation, nobody will have the right to take up anything 5 cents worth, 1 cent worth, $1 million worth. It is not yours. It is the public of Barbados. And that's why this bill is important, because it sets standards for how people in public life should operate. It indicates that if you have a conflict of interest, so take for example, you might be in construction. And fate might have it, you might also wear another hat and chair a board that might be able to grant work to construction companies. 1, you should highlight to the commission your conflict of interest. 2, you should not be engaged in any business once you wear the hat on the board, which would result in the benefit of the company for which you are also part and parcel benefiting from. That is a clear breach of conflict of interest, and this code of conduct specifically mentions it in this legislation, in this bill, on the conflict of interest. And it also touched on the use of information, which relates to persons having inside knowledge and passing it on to other persons so that they themselves might benefit, in hopes that you somewhere along the line get some benefit for sharing that information. None of those things under this bill, which now expressly states these things are not accepted, can continue once this bill is passed today. And there's only one last thing I want to highlight in this bill that I think is also important and the public should also be aware of, is the fact that it now imposes a duty on persons exercising public function to report suspected cases of corruption. That is a serious, serious, serious charge. You can no longer sit down in the office and act like you're minding your business. If you are aware, and it can be proven that you were aware that somebody has been conducting business in a corrupt manner, you now have a duty to say something. There was a saying, if you see something, say something. You cannot sit with your hands on your lap anymore. You have to do your national service to this country and report persons, because if you don't, it will slowly reap its ugly head again, and we don't want that type of behavior in this country again. Mr. President, these were just a few of the highlights from the bill that I strongly felt should be mentioned as part of my presentation. Now, in closing, Mr. President, any form of corruption, be it perceived or otherwise, it is harmful to the development of this country. This is why today, this bill will mark a significant moment in this country's history where this government will pass, hopefully, a piece of legislation that will compel all persons in public life to adhere to the principles of integrity, accountability, and transparency, thereby leading to a drastic transformation in the way we see public officials handling the public affairs of this country. Young people in today's day love to see progressive action. And I believe that this bill is indeed a progressive bill. I know that some of the senators may have their reservations, but I do hope that we can come to some middle ground and understand the importance of this bill, given recent history in this country. Mr. President, I anticipate that once this bill is passed, it will have a positive impact on the perception of the young people that I referred to earlier. And I anticipate that the conversations that I will have with them in the future would be a little more welcoming, and there will be a little bit more trust and faith in our public officials in this country. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
I next recognize Senator Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and good evening to my fellow senators. And I wish to thank those who would have given me way to say a few words at this time, given I have to leave shortly to be a part of an ordination service in my own denomination as we give thanks to God for the new ministries. I welcome the Integrity in Public Life Bill, and I do say that it's not something one would expect of a politician to bring something called the Integrity in Public Life Bill when they're in power, but I wish to commend the government for pushing this bit of legislation. But I wish to also make the point that this legislation comes at a very critical juncture in our history as a people. Just a few days ago, we would have celebrated and observed the 83rd anniversary of the 1937 riots. And a few days from now, we will be observing the 186th anniversary of our Declaration of Emancipation in this country, in this region. And the reason why I find it so important that this legislation is coming at this time is because of what happened in 1937 and the background of 1937. For those who would have done the study, just a synopsis, we would know that the conditions in Barbados in 1937 were such where there were no mass unions and the vote was restricted to a select few, persons who had at least 10 acres of land, and we know who they were. And it is only when trouble broke out in the jewel of the British Crown, its crown colony Barbados, that they came to a realization that all was not well in this part of the world, and then commissioned the Moyne Commission in 1938, which saw the introduction of mass-based trade unions, and later out of those trade unions, political parties such as the grand old party that is in power now in Barbados, and the others that emerged from it. Also coming out of the Moyne Commission was the advent of adult suffrage, where the vote was afforded to persons within the country and not restricted to the select few who had land. This current bill, for me, is an attitude check. It's an attitude check for all of us in public life to consider why we are here, why we came to it in the first place, and the obligation that is laid upon us as public servants in this country. It calls us to consider the journey of our people, to remember that the very chairs we're sitting in were not built for persons like us to sit in them. The very position we hold in this chamber, it was not meant for us to be in here. We are the products of a people who were never meant to be. But by the grace of God, we have come this far, and we've attained self-governance. And therefore, it is even more incumbent upon us in this generation to ensure that there's integrity in our actions in public life than I believe it would have been for those who were in control in 1937. Because for us, it is a sacred responsibility. We have heard a number of things outlined, a number of concerns and legitimate concerns outlined about this bill, particularly the seeming contradiction in section 19.3, where the great confidentiality of the commission can then allow the entire public to see all that you have declared. Well, for me, it's only a sheet that I have there and a couple other things. And I don't know how long he will last, because he attempted to butt me the other day, and I advised him that I know where Southern Meats is. But that's just another matter. That's just an aside. For me, sir, under the section of interpretation, there's just a clarification I need. It says a member of the House of Assembly or the Senate shall be construed to include in relation to any period between the dissolution of Parliament and the day on which the next election of members of the House of Assembly is held. I like that line, but what I would like some clarification on is, does it speak to persons who are running freshly in an election? And at what point in time will they declare their assets? Because if we are waiting for them to declare their assets when they've been elected, the horse may have already bolted. That's just my concern about that particular portion of the bill, because I've never been close to election campaigns. I've never been close to political parties. And so I've only operated on hearsay, so I wouldn't bring that here. But I will bring the issues raised by Senator Springer. And they cause me to go towards the sociological slant where this bill is concerned, where he spoke towards the reorienting of the minds of young persons. If we're going to reorient the minds of young persons, we must also reorient how persons in public life operate in plain sight of young people. I believe that there needs to be a greater commitment to the cause, as I said, for us to seriously consider why we're here and why we choose public life. One of Barbados' strengths is its political stability. But I dare say, the thing that brings about its political stability is also one of its weaknesses. And that is that there's no clear ideological divide between the main political parties. And so, young people looking on, as Senator Sands would have pointed out, must be seriously questioning the value of their vote. Because the way in which political actors can change their tune within this twinkling of an eye and morph into the shape of the other side is phenomenal, and I believe unique only to Barbados. And therefore, it brings into question, but all those nights that I went out in the dew to hear you, And then within the twinkling of an eye after you're elected, all of a sudden my vote that I give you means absolutely nothing anymore. Young people will question the process. And their parents too, as Senator Moore said. And so the value of the vote, sir, when we are talking about integrity in public life, must come to the fore. I do not know if it is true, but again, Senator Springer raised it, so I'll accept it. And it was raised by a former prime minister of this country, the whole notion of vote buying and vote selling. Again, Mr. President, it may not be the person in public life. It can be a surrogate, a shadow, that is carrying out this activity if it exists. And it begs the question, do politicians corrupt people or do people corrupt politicians? There used to be an ad on television for a university, and the ad simply says, I have no money because I don't have a job. I don't have a job because I didn't go to school. I didn't go to school because I have no money, and you just keep going around and around and around. And when it comes to political life in Barbados, one has to ask the question, I want to help the people, but I can't help the people if I don't have a seat. I can't get a seat if I don't, I wouldn't say anymore. If I don't get elected. And I can't get elected if I don't have the resources. And it goes on. And the question comes, sir, as Senators Springer and Sands and some others have mentioned, there's a lot more behind this bill than what is written on the pages here. Because it goes into the whole notion of campaign financing in Barbados. And the problem with campaign financing, sir, and vote buying and vote selling is that our politics becomes nothing more than bread and circuses. Bread and circuses is a term, panem circenses, by Juvenal around the year 100 AD. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, not church, once said, already long ago when no man sold his vote, but the people have now abdicated their duty. And a nation that once handed out military office and controlled legions, its people now wait for two things, bread and circuses. And I've said that to say, sir, that I'm not saying this is the case, but if, as Senator Sands, who is closer to our young people, have opined that 9 out of 10 of them think that the system is corrupt, though they cannot explain why it's corrupt, and probably part of the reason they cannot explain is because of the same shadows, then our politics becomes a game of musical chairs. What is musical chairs? Ever played it when you were young? You run around and you run around and you run around, and when the music stops, you sit. But in musical chairs, it's the person who plays the music that controls who sits. And so what we need to do is to find out who plays the music in Barbados. So these are all problems that we have underlying this particular piece of legislation, sir. And as was pointed out earlier, corruption does not only relate to people receiving money. Handouts, kickbacks, and that's why I said perhaps we need to go back to nomination day and not election day. Because at nomination day, the person is a potential candidate. And that is where a lot of the corruption can take place. While I'm on this matter, and the point that it does not only relate to people receiving money, I wish to throw out a word of caution to the present administration. The people of Barbados have placed their trust in you. They have given you an unprecedented majority in this country. And they expect you to operate in a way for the benefit of the entire country. And it is very difficult, I must imagine, having so large a majority, because we can easily become carried away to believe that 30 love means 100%. 30 love does not mean 100%. There are other persons out there who did not support the administration. And your duty now, even as we consider this legislation, is to make sure that there always remains that dividing line between the party and the government. Even if it's a lattice fence, put up one. Because the danger is that we can lose sight to the point where the party becomes the government. And we already saw a little snippet of that last year. I didn't raise the concerns then. I said, new government, let's take it easy. But now that we've brought this legislation, let's pay attention to that. There is no way in Barbados in the 21st century that chairpersons of boards should be reporting at a party convention. Boards are not entities of the party. I'm just set this dividing line, or else you'll end up with centralization of government in the party and not the separation that ought to exist. The party has, and the danger with that is that you see this little line that we use in Barbados that the legislation does not really recognize political parties, so once you get elected, you cross over and you do what you feel like doing. Our young people are watching. And the danger with a country like Barbados, unlike many others, is that we have invested heavily in education. You can't educate people and treat them foolish. The most dangerous person you can possibly have in a society is an educated person. And those young men that we talk about and those young people we talk about, they're educated. And they're watching. They're paying close attention. This is not a criticism, just a caution. Just a caution. I welcome this legislation. I welcome the fact that we are putting checks on ourselves as persons in public life. But let us remember that it goes far beyond the letters that are written on these pages. And our people are watching us. With those few words, I thank you, sir.
Mr. President, I rise to request the suspension of this debate for further consideration. For further consideration of this Integrity and Public Life Bill.
The question is that further consideration of the bill under consideration be
Suspend for the consideration.
Adjournment.
Requesting that further consideration.
Now, the question is that further consideration of the bill be postponed until another sitting. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
No acts for the 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this sitting do now be adjourned for 10 minutes.
Suspend.
Be suspended, sorry, suspended, sir.
Yes, the further
My
question
correction, for 10 minutes.
is that
10 minutes.
the session be now suspended for 15 minutes, coming back at 5:30.
Yes.
All honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. And we are now suspended until 5:30.